Hi folks, I wanted to just do a quick video for you guys just to showcase some of the recent acquisitions that I've made. I've done some purging of my collection. I've gotten rid of some RPGs that I didn't want anymore and kind of have traded them out in favor of games or books that I did want for RPGs that I am actively pursuing, as well as some other new acquisitions, some new games that I'm just kind of getting into as well. So I'm just going to go through a book list real quick and just talk about some of these things, just to give you guys an idea of what I've been doing in terms of RPGs lately, and potentially, hint hint, some looks at things that I might be reviewing or talking about in more detail in the future. I've acquired several books for the Star Wars D6 role-playing game. Everybody knows that that's my bread and butter RPG, and as long as I've been collecting for that game, there are still many books that have eluded making it into my collection. I did manage to acquire a Star Wars RPG product that I have been hunting for a long time. It usually goes for stupidly over-the-top prices in places like eBay because it's so hard to find. But it's a boxed set called Star Wars Lords of the Expanse, and it was it's the final box set that I need for the Star Wars RPG. This was the only box set product that I did not have for that line. It was one of the last supplements that West End Games released before they lost the Star Wars license, and I missed my opportunity when it was first published to pick it up, and so I was regretting it ever since, because as soon as West End lost the license and they stopped printing these, they became rare and ridiculous to get a hold of, but I found a really good price on one and I had to snatch it up. For anyone who's interested, and I may do a formal review of this box set. It's a setting sourcebook for a location called the Tapani Sector, which is an area of Imperial space that's ruled over by several noble houses, and when the Emperor rose to power, the nobles decided to immediately pay him lip service so that the Emperor would leave them alone and let them go about their business. And so, very interesting. I have several of the other supplement books that were released for this setting, but I never had the actual box set itself until now. I purchased several other Star Wars books as well, but I won't talk about them here. One of the things that people have probably noticed is that I talk about the Star Wars role-playing game a lot, but I don't really dedicate a whole lot of videos to the Star Wars role-playing game specifically. That's going to be changing in the near future. I'm not going to overload my channel with all Star Wars stuff, but basically I am going to give you some reviews of some of the more interesting and useful books in that line. Of course, I'm also currently a follower of Warhammer Fantasy 3rd Edition, and so I now am the owner of the newest supplement, Lure of Power, which comes with all the fiddly bits, and it also comes with Lure of Power and Liber Ecstatica, which is the book of the Chaos God Slaanesh. An old high school friend of mine I went to visit fairly recently has always had high praise for this game. He was very cool and created a copy for me of Tales from the Floating Vagabond, a ridiculous comedy sci-fi role-playing game that I've known about for many years but have never really owned a copy, so I was never able to read it and thus never able to really play the game. Now, the PDF of this game is now available on drivethrurpg.com for pretty cheap, like $5 or $6. And so if I throw out the term Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, the role-playing game, and you're intrigued at all by that concept, then go check this game out. It's basically a game of ludicrous comedy action, where your characters can be, you can have a party that includes a Viking, a Jedi, a mutant football player, you know, or any other kind of ridiculous thing that you can think of, and your character abilities are somewhat reminiscent of, say, Warner Brothers cartoons, that your characters bend or utterly shatter the natural laws as we know them. Finally, I have been kind of a dabbler, if you would even call it that, in the old school Renaissance. It sort of began when I discovered Labyrinth Lord. And I discovered Labyrinth Lord pretty early on, and I kind of flipped through it and I thought, gee, this is kind of neat. Whereas a lot of today's games are kind of focused on giving tons of options and a rule for everything, kind of creating these encyclopedic tomes of role-playing game reference. The first generation of role-playing games, they were obviously still hashing a lot of this out. It was still a new hobby, and there was still a lot to be developed. There was still a lot to be learned. And so consequently, a lot of those games were much more simplistic in their approach. They started off with very basic concepts, and they depended upon the players and the GM to really take these just little fine, tiny little nuggets of raw data and turn them into imagination. To know something about me, sometime around 2002, as D20 was booming, as the 3rd edition and the 3.5, were chugging along, I just kind of found myself in a position where I just wasn't happy with where the game was going, with what the game was focusing on, the design of the game. Where was the game design headed? And what was it trying to encourage? What was it trying to evoke? What was it trying to tell the players how this game is played? I liked the introduction of all the new options, but at the same time the game began to drown itself in the plethora of options that was available, and it created, in my particular opinion, kind of a muddy mess. D&D and I had kind of parted ways at that point. I decided that it wasn't really something that I wanted to invest a lot of my time and effort in, and other people could play it, and that was just fine, and I actually continued to be invited to and played quite happily a couple of campaigns after that, but it just wasn't a game that I was going to GM anymore. So the old school renaissance started to rekindle some interest that was non-existent for D&D for quite a long time. Well, it's kind of thanks to some of the YouTube folks here, Tim and his enthusiasm for Labyrinth Lord, and Aaron with his love of Lamentations of the Flame Princess. I was inspired to pick up a copy of Swords and Wizardry, the complete edition. This is thanks in most part to Aaron. He had a number of good things to say about this game, and I found myself rather impressed with what he was talking about, its design, goals, its approach, and basically the fact that the author has been very clever to introduce some evolution to the game, allowing it to be close enough to the source material that it still captures all that imagination, it still captures the feel of playing an old school D&D game, but at the same time taking advantage of the leaps and bounds in game design that have come since the original release of the game in 1974, tweaking it slightly, kind of simplifying some previously Byzantine concepts, basically just making the game simpler and easier to use and more approachable by a modern audience. It just about hits the right spot for me in terms of Dungeons & Dragons, that it harkens back to less character empowerment. The spells don't get as ridiculous. It's more of a low, gritty fantasy as opposed to kind of a high, heroic fantasy that Dungeons & Dragons in its later editions has become. And so I find it as a great jumping off point, and with just kind of a handful of little house rules and tweaks, ideas that I would throw out there, this could be a game that I could really get behind. Convincing my group to play it, on the other hand, is probably a different creature. For anyone who plays any older edition of D&D, Labyrinth Lord, Osric, Swords and Wizardry, or Lamentations of the Flame Princess, I highly recommend picking up this Swords and Wizardry Monster Book. Now this is in PDF form. This is a $5 book. It's 140 pages of several hundred monsters, done in old school stat block style. This is indispensable if you want to just have a good, hearty, classic monster book to go with an older edition of Dungeons & Dragons. Classic monsters as well as brand new and original monsters in here as well. And so that's been what I've acquired. That's been what I've been kind of reading recently, and so hope you guys enjoyed taking a look at it. Let me know if there is anything that you want to hear me talk about in more detail, anything that you have questions about. And thanks for watching, guys. I will see you soon. I got more reviews, I got more video responses, just generally more stuff going on, and a couple of surprises that I hope I can put out for you guys in sometime in the next couple of weeks. Things that you haven't quite seen me do on this channel before. So stay tuned.